A single day shattered an empire. On August 26, 1071, the Battle of Manzikert cracked open the Byzantine world, a defeat so profound it echoes through history even now. You are about to meet the 35 people who made it happen, from emperors and sultans to the traitors and common soldiers whose choices sealed a continent's fate. By the end, you will know the full human story behind this epic collapse, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a world remade. How did a single betrayal from within unravel centuries of power? What was the final human cost when the imperial standard fell into the dust? History often feels like an unstoppable force, but what if it all hinged on a handful of decisions? What do you think is the most dangerous flaw in any great power? The man who would face this disaster began his life far from the throne. Romanos IV Diogenes was not born to rule. He was a soldier, a general from a powerful Anatolian family, hardened by years of border warfare. His path to the imperial purple was unexpected, a twist of fate following a failed rebellion that somehow led to his pardon and marriage to the formidable Empress Eudokia. Suddenly, this military man was emperor, thrust into the heart of a decaying empire. His goal was singular and audacious: to reverse decades of decline and reclaim the rich eastern territories lost to Turkish incursions. This was not a vague ambition. It was a soldier's determination to push back the frontier and secure the very heartlands that fed and funded the Byzantine state. Yet his court in Constantinople was a nest of vipers. The powerful Doukas family, who had their own claimant to the throne, watched his every move with open contempt. They saw him not as a savior, but as an upstart, a temporary occupant of a seat they believed was rightfully theirs. So Romanos marched east not only with an army, but with the crushing weight of political sabotage brewing behind him. His entire campaign was a gamble to secure his legitimacy through a decisive military victory. Can you feel the pressure mounting? A commander needing a win not just for his empire, but for his own survival, leading an army that was already fractured by the very rivalries he left behind in the capital. Across the frontier, another leader was also consolidating his power, a man whose very name meant heroic lion. Sultan Alp Arslan ruled a vast and burgeoning Seljuk empire, a realm stretching from Central Asia to the very borders of Byzantium. He was a warrior king, yes, but his ambitions were far grander than a single battle. His true gaze was fixed south on the wealthy Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. A decisive victory that would cement his legacy as the undisputed leader of the Sunni Muslim world. The Byzantine frontier was for him a turbulent border to be managed, not the primary theater of war. This context is crucial. When Romanos marched east with his massive army, Alp Arslan was hundreds of miles away, besieging a fortress in distant Armenia. The Sultan was caught completely by surprise by the sheer scale of the Byzantine offensive. His initial attempts at diplomacy were brushed aside by an emperor confident in his overwhelming force. So what transformed this strategic situation into a legendary confrontation? It was Alp Arslan's brilliant adaptability. Forced to pivot his entire army north to meet this unexpected threat, he demonstrated the qualities that made him so formidable. He was a master of the feigned retreat, a tactic that would prove devastating on the plains of Manzikert. His cavalry, the core of his army, was not a disorganized horde but a highly disciplined force, capable of complex maneuvers on command. But his strength was not merely martial. He was also a shrewd politician who had spent years unifying the often fractious Turkish tribes under his banner. He combined a genuine religious fervor with a surprising pragmatism. He could be merciless to rebels, yet he was also known for his chivalry and his occasional acts of profound mercy towards defeated foes. This was the complex adversary now racing to intercept Emperor Romanos. One leader sought a decisive victory to secure his throne. The other was pulled into a conflict he had not sought, but was uniquely equipped to win. While Romanos and Alp Arslan maneuvered their armies, a third key figure waited in the imperial camp, his loyalty already fatally compromised. Andronikos Doukas was not just another general. He was a co-emperor, the son of the previous ruler, and he carried a bitter inheritance of hatred for the man who now wore the purple. His father, Constantine X Doukas, had been emperor before Romanos, and the Doukas family viewed Romanos as a usurper, a military adventurer who had stolen their throne through his marriage to the empress. This was not a simple rivalry, it was a deep-seated dynastic feud, and Andronikos was positioned perfectly to exploit it. He commanded the vital rear guard, a massive force of seasoned troops held in reserve, the very hammer that could secure a victory or, as it happened, engineer a defeat. As the battle reached its climax, with the Byzantine lines engaged and the Seljuk cavalry testing their flanks, a treacherous rumor began to spread like wildfire through the ranks. The word was that the emperor had fallen. It was Andronikos himself, historians suggest, who gave the order for the rear guard to turn away from the fighting and retreat back to the camp. Imagine the confusion and sheer panic that order would have caused. The soldiers in the front, locked in combat, suddenly see their main reserve, their lifeline, abandoning them. Their line of retreat is cut, their morale shatters in an instant. Was this a cowardly mistake or a calculated act of political murder? The evidence points heavily to treachery. Andronikos had everything to gain from Romanos' fall. With the emperor captured or killed on the field, the path to the throne would be clear for the Doukas family once more. His retreat did not just lose a battle, it deliberately sacrificed an entire army and an emperor to serve a family's ambition. In that single selfish decision, the fate of an empire was sealed not by the enemy's sword, but by a dagger wielded from within. That order to retreat echoed across the field, and its first catastrophic effect was felt on the left wing. Commanding that vital flank was Nikephoros Braianios, a seasoned general with a lifetime of military experience. He was no young noble seeking glory, he was a hardened professional, a man who had fought for years against the empire's enemies. His loyalty to Emperor Romanos, however, was a complex and fragile thing. He served the throne, but his personal allegiance was likely strained by the poisonous politics of Constantinople, caught between the emperor and the scheming Doukas faction. As the battle unfolded, Braianios and his soldiers found themselves facing the full fury of the Seljuk cavalry tactics. Wave after wave of horse archers would sweep in, loose a storm of arrows, and then feign a panicked retreat, luring the disciplined Byzantine formations to break ranks and give chase. It was a deadly, exhausting game. Braianios, understanding the danger, likely fought to maintain his lines, his troops holding firm against this relentless, harrying pressure. Then came the moment of betrayal, the sight of Andronikos Doukas and the entire rear guard suddenly turning away from the battle would have been utterly devastating. For the soldiers on the left flank, it meant their line of retreat was instantly severed. The psychological shock was as lethal as any arrow. Confidence crumbled into confusion, and confusion spiraled into outright panic. What was the point of holding the line when your own army was abandoning you? The orderly ranks under Braianios' command dissolved into a chaotic mob. Men who had stood firm moments before now turned and ran for their lives, desperate to escape the closing trap. The general himself, a veteran of countless battles, was suddenly powerless. No amount of personal bravery or shouted commands could stop the tidal wave of fear. His wing did not merely retreat, it disintegrated, creating a gaping hole in the Byzantine army that the Seljuk cavalry surged through. In that single cascading failure, we see the entire tragedy of Manzikert. It was not just one act of treason, but how that treason multiplied across the field, turning disciplined soldiers into a terrified rabble and ensuring a defeat became a rout. Yet another mystery was unfolding far from the main battlefield. While the left wing crumbled under the weight of treason, the fate of a massive portion of the Byzantine army remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. Joseph Tarchanaiotes was one of Emperor Romanos' most senior commanders, leading a powerful contingent that may have numbered as many as 30,000 men, a force that included the formidable Frankish mercenaries from Western Europe. These were not auxiliary troops, they were a decisive part of the emperor's battle plan, yet when the armies clashed at Manzikert, Tarchanaiotes and his entire division were nowhere to be found. So what happened to them? The historical record is frustratingly silent, giving rise to three compelling theories. The first suggests he was sent on a separate mission, perhaps to secure a nearby fortress or to intercept a suspected Seljuk reinforcement column. This would mean the emperor had willingly divided his forces right before the decisive engagement, a risky move born of overconfidence or faulty intelligence. The second, more sinister theory is desertion. Did Tarchanaiotes, perhaps influenced by the same Doukas family intrigues that corrupted Andronikos, simply turn his back and march his men away, leaving his emperor to his fate. The third possibility is the most tragic, that his force was ambushed and wiped out days before the main battle in a smaller, unrecorded skirmish. This would mean the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert was preceded by another hidden disaster. Without Tarchenios and his professional soldiers, including those hard-fighting Franks, the Byzantine army was not just betrayed, it was already crippled, fighting at barely half its intended strength from the very start. His disappearance is the ghost in the machine of this battle, a void that may have sealed the empire's doom long before the first Seljuk arrow was ever loosed. Into this chaos of betrayal and disintegration rode a man of pure, reckless ambition. His name was Nikephoros Basilakes, a general whose fiery temper and hunger for glory would ignite the final catastrophe. He was likely a Norman mercenary, a descendant of the fierce Vikings who had settled in southern Italy, and he carried that warrior culture's love for the decisive, headlong charge. As the Byzantine army advanced and the Seljuk horse archers began their harrying tactics, Basilakes saw not a threat but an opportunity. He believed he saw a moment of weakness in the enemy lines, a chance to win immortal fame in a single stunning blow. Without waiting for the emperor's command, he gathered his own contingent of heavy cavalry and launched a furious, unsanctioned charge directly into the heart of the Seljuk skirmishers. For a moment it must have looked magnificent, a thunderous wave of armored knights promising to crush the enemy, but it was a deadly illusion. The Seljuk retreat was not a rout, it was a well-rehearsed trap. As Basilakes and his men surged forward, they broke completely from the main Byzantine formation, creating a fatal gap between his unit and the rest of the army. The disciplined Seljuk cavalry simply parted before his charge, allowing his force to plunge harmlessly into empty space, and then they swiftly closed the gap behind him. In an instant, Basilakes and his elite troops were completely surrounded and cut off from the emperor's main force. His ill-considered bid for personal glory had achieved the very thing the Seljuk commanders hoped for. It had broken the solid, unbreakable line that was the core of Byzantine military doctrine. With the center now exposed and unbalanced, the main Seljuk forces swept in, not to meet the Byzantines head-on, but to envelop them, to curl around their flanks like two great pincers. Basilakes' charge was the spark, the treason of Andronikos Doukas was the fuel, and together they created an inferno from which Emperor Romanos and his loyal soldiers could not escape. What does it say when an empire is brought low not just by its traitors, but by the unchecked ambition of its own heroes? While the wings collapsed in chaos, the center of the Byzantine line was a fortress of desperation. Here, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Emperor Romanos, was a commander named Aliat, a man whose very presence signaled the empire's dire need for its most elite warriors. He was likely an officer of the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal protectors, a force composed not of native Byzantines but of axe-wielding Northmen and Anglo-Saxons. These were the men who formed the unbreakable core of the army, a living wall of steel and loyalty. As Nikephoros Basilakes' reckless charge shattered the formation and Andronikos Doukas' betrayal severed their retreat, the battle transformed for Aliat and his warriors. Their grand offensive was over. The fight was now a brutal, shrinking circle of survival. The disciplined advance gave way to a savage melee. The air would have been thick with the crash of metal, the guttural war cries of the Varangians, and the lethal hum of Seljuk arrows arcing down into the tightening mass of men. Aliat's duty was no longer to win the field but to save the emperor. He and his guards would have locked their massive shields, forming a testudo, a tortoise shell, around Romanos, deflecting a storm of missiles. Their Great Dane axes, weapons that could cleave a horse and rider in two, swung in deadly arcs, holding the swarming Turkish cavalry at bay for precious, bloody minutes. This was not the glorious warfare of imperial banners, but the grim, close-quarters butchery of a last stand. Every inch of ground was paid for in lives. Can you see them, this shrinking island of loyalty in a sea of treachery? While others fled or betrayed, Aliat and his men stood firm, their foreign origins meaning nothing in that final hour, their only identity defined by their oath to protect the emperor. They were the final failing heartbeat of the Byzantine center, fighting not for a dynasty or a political cause, but for the man standing beside them. Their heroic, hopeless stand raises a haunting question. What is the true value of absolute loyalty when everything else has turned to dust? Even as his own commanders were failing him, Emperor Romanos was being perfectly observed by an unseen enemy. While the Byzantine army marched east, a lone Seljuk scout was already watching, a ghost on the horizon whose report would shape the entire battle. We do not know his name, his face, or his tribe, but his role was as crucial as any general's. His mission was one of pure intelligence, to find the massive imperial force and report back everything: its size, its direction, its morale, and its exact composition. Riding a swift and hardy steppe pony, he would have shadowed the Byzantines at a safe distance, a tiny, mobile speck against the vast Anatolian plain. He counted the regiments, noted the different banners of Frankish mercenaries and Varangian guards, and observed the slow, lumbering progress of the supply train. Most importantly, he pinpointed their final camp near the fortress of Manzikert. This was the information that changed everything. When this scout finally reached Sultan Alp Arslan, his report was not one of panic, but of precise, actionable detail. He told the Sultan exactly where the enemy was, how many they were, and what kind of soldiers made up their ranks. This allowed Alp Arslan to make a series of brilliant, calculated decisions. He knew the terrain around Manzikert was open, perfect for his cavalry's hit-and-run tactics. He understood that the Byzantine army, for all its size, was a heterogeneous mix that might not fight as one. With this scout's eyes, Alp Arslan could see the entire Byzantine plan laid bare before him. He could choose the ground, prepare his ambushes, and plan his feigned retreats with a commander's perfect knowledge. This anonymous rider was the catalyst that transformed a potential disaster for the Seljuks into a perfect trap. What does it say? That the fate of empires can sometimes rest not on a king's command, but on the sharp eyes of a single, nameless man. But the land itself was a treacherous ally. As the massive Byzantine army marched deeper into Armenia, they moved through a landscape of hidden valleys and deceptive passes, a terrain that could hide an entire army just beyond the next ridge. Their survival depended on local knowledge, and this need introduces our ninth key figure, the anonymous Armenian guide. We know nothing about this man for certain, not his name or his village, but his potential role is a chilling mystery. Was he a loyal subject of the empire, doing his best to lead a foreign army through his homeland? Or was he a man with his own complex loyalties, a Christian who perhaps saw the Byzantine emperor not as a liberator, but as just another foreign master from Constantinople? The Armenian kingdoms had long been caught between the hammer of Byzantium and the anvil of the Seljuk Turks, their independence eroded by both. It is a haunting possibility that the guide leading Romanos' army toward Manzikert was, either through coercion or secret agreement, also providing information to the other side. He would have known every hidden spring, every narrow defile where an ambush could be laid, every patch of soft ground that would slow the heavy Byzantine cavalry. If he subtly misdirected the imperial army, even by a mile or by choosing a more exposed campsite, his actions would have had consequences as deadly as any traitor's sword. This single unseen figure embodies the entire fractured political reality of the frontier. For the common people living there, the great clash of empires was not an abstract conflict, but a daily struggle for survival where allegiances could shift with the wind. How do you know who to trust when you are marching into a land where your very presence might be resented? The guide's story, lost to history, forces us to ask whether the greatest danger to an invading army is not the enemy it can see, but the trust it places in the shadows. Amidst the clashing steel and the rising dust, one man held the soul of the empire aloft. He was the standard-bearer of Romanos IV, his sole duty to keep the great imperial labarum, the purple and gold battle standard, flying high above the fray. This was no mere flag, it was a sacred symbol, a visible sign of God's favor and the emperor's presence. For every soldier on that chaotic field, a glance toward that standard was a check on their courage, a confirmation that their leader was alive, that the center held, that there was still a cause to fight for. As long as it waved, the battle was not lost. Then came the moment everything shattered. Perhaps a stray arrow found its mark, perhaps the bearer's horse was cut from under him, or perhaps in the desperate, close-quarters press of the final stand, he was simply overwhelmed by the swarming Seljuk cavalry. The exact cause is lost to time, but the consequence was immediate and catastrophic. The imperial standard wavered, tilted, and then plunged into the bloody muck of the battlefield. To the Byzantine army, it was as if the sun had abruptly fallen from the sky. The visual signal was unmistakable and universal. The emperor has fallen, the center is broken, all is lost. That single silent event triggered a psychological domino effect more devastating than any cavalry charge. The last shreds of discipline evaporated. What had been a desperate fight for survival became a frantic every man for himself scrambled to escape. The army transformed from an organized force into a terrified mob, its cohesion vanishing in the time it took for a banner to hit the ground. How fragile is the will to fight when its most powerful symbol is suddenly gone? In that one stark image, the fallen standard lying trampled in the dirt, we see the complete and utter collapse of an empire's order, replaced by the raw, unchecked terror of a world coming to an end. The chaos of the falling standard was a signal for the final, decisive blow. While the horse archers were the relentless needle, the Seljuk army also wielded a mighty hammer. This was the Gulam, the elite slave soldier who represented the pinnacle of Seljuk military power. These were not conscripts or tribal levies, but professional warriors, often taken as prisoners of war in their youth and raised from childhood to serve only the Sultan. Their entire world was the training ground and the battlefield. They were masters of the lance and the mace, and they were encased in fine lamellar armor, small overlapping plates of steel laced together, which covered both them and their powerful war horses. This made them a terrifying hybrid, a heavily armored knight who could still maneuver with the speed of a cavalryman. Their role was to wait, a solid, patient core amidst the swirling chaos of the skirmishers. They would hold their position until the enemy was exhausted, disorganized, and vulnerable from the constant harassment. Then and only then would they strike. Picture a Byzantine unit, its shields locked in a desperate wall, having just weathered another feigned retreat. The soldiers are breathless, their arms tired from holding formation against an enemy that will not stand and fight. Suddenly the sea of light cavalry parts. From the gap a line of Gulams emerges, not at a gallop, but at a steady, earth-shaking trot. They lower their long lances, a unified forest of steel points aimed at the heart of the Byzantine line. There is no wild charge, only a disciplined, terrifying advance that gathers momentum with every hoofbeat. The impact is not a clash, it is a demolition. Their lances punch through shields and armor, splintering the formation. Then as the line shatters, the Gulams draw their maces and swords, methodically dismantling the broken unit. This was not a frenzied attack, it was a precise professional execution. The horse archers had softened the target, and the Gulams delivered the killing stroke. This combination of light and heavy forces, of feint and hammer blow, was a military symphony, and at Manzikert it played the empire's requiem. How to defeat an enemy whose every move is part of a perfectly rehearsed and devastatingly effective dance. Against this disciplined hammer blow stood the empire's own anvil. The Byzantine cataphract was a vision of imperial power made steel, a near mythical figure whose very appearance was meant to break enemy lines through sheer, terrifying presence. Clad from head to toe in lamellar armor, thousands of small iron plates laced tightly together, he was a man transformed into a slow-moving fortress. His horse, too, was often armored, creating a single, unstoppable unit of immense weight and power. In his hand he held a kontos, a massive lance that required both hands to wield, a weapon designed to shatter formations on impact. This was the dream of the Byzantine charge, a wall of iron and muscle that would hit the enemy center like a thunderclap, driving deep and sowing instant panic. But at Manzikert, this dream met a reality for which it was utterly unprepared. The Seljuk horse archers refused to stand and receive the charge. They were not a solid line to be broken, but a fluid, swirling cloud of swift horsemen. As the cataphracts lumbered forward, their great lances lowered, the Turkish riders would simply melt away, galloping just out of range. Then they would turn in their saddles, a skill perfected on the steppes, and unleash a storm of arrows upon the heavily armored knights. The cataphracts were built for a direct collision, not a protracted chase. Their armor, which made them so formidable in a close melee, became a deadly liability. It exhausted them and their horses under the baking Anatolian sun, turning them into slow, overheating targets. Each missed charge left them more strung out, more isolated from the infantry, and more vulnerable. Their great lances were useless against an enemy who would not stand and fight, and their swords were too short to reach the elusive riders who encircled them. Can you feel the frustration, the very qualities that define their elite status, their immense strength, their impregnable armor, their overwhelming charge, were systematically neutralized by an enemy who understood that the greatest weapon is sometimes not power, but motion. The cataphract, the pride of the Byzantine army, was rendered a magnificent, expensive, and tragically ineffective relic on the field of Manzikert, a giant being bled to death by 1,000 swift, stinging cuts. He was the engine of the Seljuk victory, a warrior born to the saddle. The horse archer did not simply ride to battle, he lived on horseback, a fusion of man and animal that gave him a fluidity the rigid Byzantine lines could never match. His entire life on the steppes was a training ground. From childhood, he learned to guide his pony with his knees alone, leaving his hands free to wield his most devastating weapon, the composite bow. This was no simple wooden stave. It was a technological marvel, crafted from layers of wood, sinew, and horn laminated together. This complex construction gave it a ferocious power, capable of launching an arrow with enough force to pierce armor at a staggering distance. His tactics were psychological as much as they were physical. He would swarm the Byzantine formations, not to engage in a direct fight, but to unleash a relentless storm of arrows in a technique known as shower shooting. Imagine not a single aimed shot, but a continuous high-arcing volley. Hundreds of archers would fire almost straight up, their arrows raining down in a terrifying, indiscriminate hail onto the tightly packed enemy ranks. There was no shield wall high enough to stop this deadly rain from the sky. The goal was not to kill every soldier, but to shred their morale and break their formation. The constant whistling death from above created an unbearable strain. Men could not rest, could not advance effectively, and could only watch as their comrades fell beside them, pierced by shafts they never saw coming. This was a war of exhaustion. The horse archer would sweep in, unleash his volley, and then spin away before the heavier Byzantine cavalry could even react, only to circle back and begin the process again moments later. He was a phantom, draining the will of a vastly more powerful army one arrow at a time. How to defeat an enemy who refuses to stand and fight, who turns the very sky into your greatest adversary. This relentless, draining harassment was the essential prelude to the final, crushing charge of the Gulam Knights, the anvil against which the Byzantine army was finally broken. He was a world away from the fields of Normandy. This Frankish knight, clad in chainmail and dreaming of plunder, had crossed continents to fight for a foreign emperor. His motivations were not loyalty or faith, but the simple, powerful lure of gold and land. The Byzantine treasury paid well for the services of these hardened Western warriors, men whose heavy cavalry charge was a legendary shock force on any battlefield. His entire world was built around that single decisive moment of impact. He would lower his long, couched lance, his armored destrier thundering forward, and aim to shatter the enemy line in one earth-shaking collision. This was a style of war completely alien to the hit-and-run tactics of the steppes and the disciplined formations of the Byzantines. It was brutal, direct, and utterly dependent on a solid enemy to smash against. But what was his fate at Manzikert? He belonged to the contingent of General Joseph Tarchanaotes, the massive force that vanished before the battle. Did he ever even see the Seljuk army? One possibility is that he died in some forgotten skirmish days earlier. His legendary charge never launched, his body left in an unmarked Armenian gully. Another more haunting possibility is that he was still with Tarchanaotes when the order came to retreat, his unit turning its back on the distant sound of battle. Imagine his frustration, a warrior bred for combat, forced to march away from the greatest fight of his life, his skills wasted, his paymaster abandoned. His absence and the absence of thousands like him left a gaping hole in Emperor Romanos' battle line. The Byzantine center lacked that final, crushing hammer blow that the Frankish knights provided. It meant the Seljuk cavalry never faced the one Western tactic that could have disrupted their fluid maneuvers. What does it say about the empire's reach that its fate relied on a hired sword from so far away? A man who may have perished without ever knowing the battle that would define his era was lost in his absence. He fought for a land that was no longer his own. While the great empires of Byzantium and the Seljuks clashed, the Armenian infantryman stood on that field with a divided heart. His homeland, the ancient kingdoms of Armenia, had been swallowed for generations, its independence crushed between the competing ambitions of Constantinople and new powers from the east. When Emperor Romanos marched into Armenia, he did not come as a liberator of a free people, but as a master rallying his subjects. The Armenian foot soldier answered the call to the Byzantine banner, but his loyalty was a fragile thing, tempered by generations of betrayal and shifting overlords. He knew this land intimately, every hidden path and every defensible hill, knowledge that should have been the empire's greatest advantage, yet that same knowledge could also be a source of deep resentment. Why should he fight and die for an emperor in a far-off city who had himself stripped his ancestors of their crowns? This internal conflict, this struggle for a cause that was not truly his, shaped his every action on the day of battle. Deployed likely on the flanks or in support of the main lines, the Armenian infantry would have borne the initial brunt of the Seljuk horse archers' relentless harassment. Without the heavy armor of the cataphracts or the disciplined drills of the core Byzantine troops, they were exposed as the deadly arrows rained down. Their morale, already tentative, would have been the first to fracture. Can a man truly hold the line when he is fighting for a flag that represents his own people's subjugation? It is possible that entire units of Armenian infantry began to melt away from the flanks early in the fighting, not out of cowardice, but out of a calculated decision for self-preservation. Their withdrawal would have opened fatal gaps, allowing the swift Seljuk cavalry to curl around the Byzantine army much earlier and with greater ease. Their wavering was not a single act of treachery like that of Andronikos Doukas, but a slow, silent bleeding away of the army's strength from its very edges. In the battle's aftermath, as the shattered empire retreated, many of these same Armenian soldiers simply returned to their villages. Their story forces us to ask a difficult question: what is the true price of demanding loyalty from those whose land you occupy? The battle was lost not only by the traitors in the command tent, but by the silent, hopeless withdrawal of the men who had the most to lose and the least to gain from an imperial victory. While the Armenian infantry questioned their cause, a unifying voice rose from the Seljuk camp. The imam of the army was far more than a mere holy man. He was a master of morale, a spiritual warrior whose words forged a common purpose from a collection of disparate tribes. On the eve of battle, he would have stood before the entire host, leading them in solemn prayer. His voice, chanting verses from the Quran, would have echoed across the plains, a stark contrast to the fractured loyalties and political intrigue plaguing the Byzantine ranks. This was not just a ritual, it was a powerful act of psychological preparation, framing the coming conflict not as a simple border skirmish, but as a righteous jihad, a struggle in the path of God. For the average Seljuk soldier, this was a transformative idea. He was no longer just a tribesman fighting for his chieftain or for plunder. He was a soldier of faith, and a victory would grant him divine favor and a place in paradise. This spiritual conviction created a level of discipline and commitment that sheer military strategy could never achieve. The imam likely counseled Sultan Alp Arslan himself, reinforcing the Sultan's own image as a pious leader and a champion of Islam. This religious fervor directly countered the heavy armor and numerical advantage of the Byzantines with an invisible, unbreakable shield of belief. When the horse archers swept in for their daring feigned retreats, they did so with the courage of men who believed their cause was sacred. When the Gulam knights held their line, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, they did so with the patience of the devout. How to break an army that believes God is on its side? The imam's prayers rising into the Anatolian sky were as vital to the Seljuk victory as any arrow or lance, turning a military confrontation into a crusade and ensuring every man fought with the conviction that heaven itself was watching. The true cost of the collapse was paid in the camp, not on the battlefield. While soldiers fell to steel and arrows, the empire's lifeblood, its food, its pay chests, its very means of survival, was left utterly undefended. This was the world of the Byzantine camp follower, a vast and bustling city of canvas that moved with the army. Here, the cooks, the merchants, the wives, and the servants created a fragile semblance of home, their lives tethered to the army's fortunes. They were the unseen engine of the campaign, grinding grain for bread, tending to wounded horses and mending torn armor. Their survival depended entirely on the wall of soldiers standing between them and the enemy. When that wall crumbled, their world ended in an instant. The first sign of disaster was a distant, growing roar, the sound of thousands of men not shouting in battle, but screaming in pure panic. Then came the flood, a torrent of broken soldiers pouring into the camp, their eyes wide with terror, dropping their weapons as they ran. Discipline evaporated. The rear guard under the treacherous Andronikos Doukas had already secured their own escape, leaving the camp and everyone in it as a sacrifice to slow the pursuing Seljuk cavalry. What followed was not a battle, but a frenzy. The Seljuk riders, swift and merciless, swept through the tents. They were not there to kill the non-combatants outright, but to capture them, for a living prisoner meant a future slave and a ransom. The air filled with the screams of women and children being torn from their shelters, the grunts of men fighting over chests of imperial gold, and the crackle of fire as tents were set ablaze. The army's entire food supply was either looted or burned, its reserve weapons were scattered, its medical supplies were trampled into the mud. In a single violent hour, the Byzantine army lost any chance of regrouping, of forming a new defensive line, of ever being a coherent force again. The soldier on the field might be captured or killed, but the destruction of the camp meant the entire military structure of the expedition was annihilated. How do you measure the true scale of a defeat? It is found not only in the number of the dead, but in the shattered lives of those who never raised a sword, and in the silent, empty wagons that would never make the journey home. The emperor's final attempt to avoid war arrived as an insult. Romanos dispatched a high-ranking envoy to Sultan Alp Arslan's camp with a message that was less a negotiation and more an ultimatum. This unnamed diplomat, standing before the most powerful Turkish ruler of the age, was instructed to demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Seljuk forces from what Byzantium considered its imperial territory. It was a breathtaking display of arrogance, a relic of a time when Constantinople's word was law. The envoy delivered his message, representing an empire that was already bleeding from within, to a sultan who commanded a united and highly motivated army. Alp Arslan's response was not the rage one might expect. Instead, he displayed a cunning pragmatism. Historians suggest he offered surprisingly generous terms. He proposed a formal peace treaty, a fixed annual tribute, and even the offer of military assistance to the Byzantine emperor against his other enemies. This was not the act of a desperate man, but of a confident strategist who saw little to gain and much to lose in a massive, pitched battle. He was still hoping to turn his army south toward Egypt. The envoy carried these terms back to Romanos, a chance to save his army and his throne without a single drop of blood being spilled. But the emperor, surrounded by advisors and buoyed by the sheer size of his own forces, refused. He saw the offer not as a diplomatic solution, but as a sign of weakness. In his mind, only a decisive, glorious victory on the battlefield could secure his political position and restore the empire's fading prestige. So he dismissed the peace and pushed his army onward. That single decision, the rejection of a lifeline, locked the two empires on a collision course. Why would a commander choose the uncertainty of battle over the certainty of a peaceful settlement? The answer lies in the toxic politics of Constantinople, where perception often mattered more than reality, and where an emperor felt he needed a spectacular victory just to survive. The dust had barely settled when the true extent of the emperor's wounds became clear. Romanos IV Diogenes, the ruler of a vast empire, now lay broken and bleeding on the ground, his body battered from the fierce close-quarters combat of his final stand. His captors, following the strict codes of chivalry their sultan demanded, did not leave him to suffer. They summoned a physician, likely a learned man traveling with the Seljuk court who was well versed in the medical traditions of the era. His task was grim and urgent. He would have cleaned the deep wounds, perhaps from a sword slash to the arm or a lance thrust that had pierced his armor, staunching the bleeding with pressure and clean cloths. He may have applied herbal poultices to prevent infection and used splints to stabilize broken bones sustained in the brutal melee or from a fall from his horse. This was not gentle medicine, but the essential, painful work of saving a life performed on a man who had just lost everything. Yet this physical mending was only the beginning of a far more complex ritual. When Romanos was stable enough to stand, he was brought before Sultan Alp Arslan. The scene was one of profound and unexpected dignity. The victorious ruler did not gloat or humiliate his prisoner. Instead, he treated the defeated emperor with a respect that acknowledged his rank and his courage. Alp Arslan famously placed his own foot on the Roman emperor's neck, a powerful symbolic act of conquest. but then he immediately helped him to his feet and offered him a seat at his own table. For 3 days, Romanos was hosted as an honored guest, not a caged animal. The two leaders even shared meals and discussed politics and war as if they were old acquaintances. This extraordinary courtesy was a calculated act of statesmanship designed to pave the way for a favorable peace treaty, but it was also rooted in a warrior's code that honored a brave adversary. This humane treatment on the battlefield makes the betrayal waiting for him at home all the more devastating. The physician's careful work had saved his body, and the Sultan's respect had spared his dignity, but neither could protect him from the political venom that had already poisoned his own capital. How does a man survive a battle with his enemies, only to be destroyed by the very people he was fighting for? The lone rider carried not just a message, but the end of an empire. His horse stumbled with exhaustion, its coat lathered in sweat and dust as he pushed on toward the golden domes of Constantinople. He was a survivor of the rout, a man who had witnessed the standard fall and the camp burn, and his mission was to deliver the unthinkable to the capital. The news he bore was a living thing, a contagion of despair that would shatter the city's illusions of invincibility. He did not know that his arrival would be the starting pistol for a political coup. When he finally staggered through the city gates, his words were not met with grief, but with cold, calculated opportunity. The Doukas family, led by the Caesar John Doukas, brother of the previous emperor, had been waiting for this moment. They did not mourn the captured Romanos, they seized his throne. The messenger's report of catastrophe was their justification. They declared the emperor dead, a necessary fiction to bypass the legal complications of a captured ruler, and they swiftly crowned their own boy, Michael VII, as the sole legitimate emperor. The city did not rise to avenge its fallen soldiers. It was gripped by a silent, bureaucratic takeover. This was the final cruel betrayal. Romanos had survived the Sultan's foot on his neck, only to be politically executed by the very people he had left in power. The rider's grim duty was complete. He had delivered the truth, and in doing so, he had handed the keys of the empire to the men who had engineered its defeat. How quickly does a military disaster become a political weapon in the hands of those waiting in the shadows? While the true emperor was a prisoner of war, a very different man claimed his throne. Michael VII Doukas was the young, bookish son of a previous ruler, a scholar more comfortable with philosophy manuscripts than military strategy. He had been left in Constantinople as a nominal co-emperor, a political figurehead under the thumb of his powerful uncle, while Romanos marched off to war. The news of the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert was not a tragedy for Michael, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. With Romanos captured and the army destroyed, the path to absolute power was suddenly clear. He and his uncle, the Caesar John Doukas, moved with ruthless speed. They declared before the entire court and the people of the city that Emperor Romanos was dead. This was a deliberate, calculated lie designed to sever all legal and emotional ties to the defeated ruler. They presented themselves not as usurpers, but as the only stable government left, the saviors of an empire in its darkest hour. Michael VII was swiftly crowned as the sole legitimate emperor, his face now on the coins, his name in the prayers, but their power was built on a foundation of sand, for they knew the terrifying truth. Romanos IV was still alive. The Sultan had not only spared him, but honoring their peace treaty had now released him. The returning emperor was marching home, expecting to resume his rule. Michael and his uncle faced an impossible choice. To accept Romanos back would mean admitting their own lie, surrendering the throne, and almost certainly facing execution for treason. They had painted themselves into a corner from which there was only one gruesome way out. They sent their agents to intercept the returning emperor. Romanos was seized, dragged from his tent, and subjected to the Byzantine Empire's traditional punishment for a usurper, a sentence so brutal it was meant to render the victim both politically and symbolically incapable of ever ruling again. He was blinded not with a swift, clean strike, but with a method designed to cause maximum, lasting damage, often using hot irons. The act was a deliberate destruction of a man, a permanent removal from the world of sight and power. Michael VII, the quiet scholar, had thus secured his throne not through battle or merit, but through a vicious act of political murder. His reign would be marked by incompetence and economic collapse, proving that the man who seizes power through betrayal is rarely the man capable of wielding it wisely. The empire, already reeling from a military catastrophe, now had to endure a ruler whose very claim to power was stained by the blood and broken eyes of the one man who had tried to save it. The news of her husband's capture would have struck the imperial palace like a physical blow. Eudokia Macrombolitissa was no ordinary empress. Before her marriage to Romanos, she had ruled the Byzantine Empire herself as regent, a powerful and intelligent woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of court politics with skill. She was the widow of Emperor Constantine X Doukas, and her marriage to Romanos IV had been a strategic union, a soldier emperor to defend the frontiers and an empress to secure the dynasty. Now that careful arrangement lay in ruins, while the Doukas faction moved swiftly to crown her own son, Michael, and push her aside. Eudokia did not surrender quietly. She fought a desperate rearguard action to save her husband. Using her remaining influence, she is said to have sent urgent messages, perhaps even emissaries, to negotiate for Romanos' release, trying to uphold the legitimacy of his rule from a position of rapidly diminishing power. But she was utterly outmaneuvered. Her political capital evaporated the moment the Doukas family controlled the narrative in Constantinople. The very bloodline that gave her son his claim, the Doukas name, was now the instrument of her own destruction. Her efforts to secure Romanos' return were not just ignored, they were treated as a threat to the new regime. The final personal tragedy was her forced retirement. To eliminate her completely from the game of power, her brother-in-law, John Doukas, compelled her to take holy vows and enter a monastery. This was the traditional method for removing a formidable woman from politics, a quiet banishment behind stone walls. In a single brutal move, she lost her husband, her authority, and her public life. Her story is a stark reminder that the collapse at Manzikert was not just a military event, but a shattering of families and futures. How does a ruler, once the most powerful woman in the empire, cope when the political world she mastered suddenly exiles her from itself? History is written by the victors, and in the Seljuk camp, a quiet scholar was already at work. This chronicler, a man of letters in a world of warriors, held a power as great as any general's, the power of the pen. His task was to transform the raw chaos of battle into a coherent and glorious narrative for Sultan Alp Arslan. His account would not be a dry list of facts, but a carefully crafted story designed to celebrate the Sultan's wisdom, his piety, and his chivalry. He would have highlighted Alp Arslan's initial attempts at peace, framing the Byzantine rejection as arrogant folly. The battle itself will be portrayed not as a lucky victory, but as a divinely ordained triumph, a testament to the faith and discipline of the Muslim army. Most importantly, the chronicler would immortalize the Sultan's merciful treatment of the captured Emperor Romanos. That moment, with the foot on the neck followed by the hand of friendship, was not just a personal act of mercy, it was a masterstroke of political theater, and the chronicler made sure the world knew it. He was shaping the legacy of Manzikert for generations, cementing Alp Arslan's reputation as an ideal Islamic ruler, both a fierce warrior and a magnanimous sovereign. This narrative, repeated and embellished across the Islamic world, would solidify the Seljuk claim to leadership and justify their future expansion. What is the true price of a single historical account? The story we inherit is often the one that served the powerful, a polished version of events where messy realities are smoothed away to build a legend. While the Seljuk chronicler crafted a tale of glorious victory, a very different story was being written in the quiet of a Byzantine monastery. Far from the battlefield, a monk sat in his cell, his quill scratching across parchment by the light of a single candle. The news from the east had finally reached him, a slow-moving tide of horror and despair. He was not recording a military defeat, he was documenting the wrath of God. For this monk and for countless others within the shattered empire, the catastrophe at Manzikert was not a failure of tactics or loyalty, it was a divine punishment. In his chronicle, the battle was a direct consequence of the empire's internal corruption, its theological squabbles, and the moral decay of its leaders. The treacherous Doukas family, the blinding of a rightful emperor, the greed and ambition that festered in Constantinople, all of this was evidence of a people who had turned away from God's path. The monk saw the Seljuk Turks not merely as human enemies, but as a scourge, an instrument of heavenly judgment sent to chastise a sinful nation. His account will be filled with lamentations, interpreting the loss of Anatolia as a new Babylonian exile, a profound spiritual crisis that demanded repentance and prayer. How do you process a disaster that shatters your entire world? You frame it within the only story that makes sense, a story of sin and retribution. This theological interpretation became the dominant Byzantine memory of the event, a narrative of collective guilt that overshadowed the simpler, more human truths of betrayal and bad decisions. The Monk's Chronicle was a search for meaning in the ruins, a desperate attempt to find a divine plan in the midst of earthly chaos. The emperor's brief taste of freedom ended in a dusty roadside ambush. Romanos IV, released by his noble captor and traveling under a fragile truce, was seized not by Seljuk warriors, but by soldiers wearing the imperial purple. These were the men of the Tagma, the very palace guard whose duty was to protect the emperor's person, but their loyalty had been purchased in his absence. They answered now to the Doukas family, to the new regime in Constantinople that could not allow a living, breathing Romanos to return and reclaim his throne. The guard who carried out the arrest was not a faceless brute. He was a professional soldier, a man who had likely sworn an oath to Romanos himself. His betrayal was a cold political calculation, an order followed to secure his own position in the new order. Imagine the moment of recognition, the chilling silence as the former emperor looked into the eyes of the men who were supposed to be his protectors and saw only his executioners. There was no grand battle, no last stand. It was a quiet administrative murder. The soldiers dragged Romanos from his tent, and the sentence was carried out with bureaucratic cruelty. He was subjected to the traditional punishment for a usurper, a blinding so vicious and deliberate that it was meant to erase not just his sight, but his very identity as a ruler. In the Byzantine world, a blind man could not hold the throne. The physical agony was unimaginable, but the psychological devastation was absolute. The general who had led 100,000 men, the emperor who had negotiated with sultans, was reduced to a broken, helpless figure, his world plunged into permanent darkness by the very institution he had fought to save. What does it say about a state when its most loyal defenders become its most efficient assassins? This final, intimate betrayal was the true end of the Battle of Manzikert, proving that the most fatal wounds are often inflicted not by enemies on the field, but by comrades in the quiet moments after the fighting is done. The blinding of Romanos was not an end, but a signal. It announced to every ambitious warlord on the frontier that the great empire was now a bleeding giant, and its richest provinces were there for the taking. Among the first to answer this call was a figure who embodied the new reality, a Ghazi commander whose life was dedicated to expanding the faith through conquest. Unlike the disciplined armies of Sultan Alp Arslan, his followers were a mix of tribal warriors, religious zealots, and adventurers, all united by a simple, powerful goal: to carry the war deep into the heart of Anatolia. For them, Manzikert was not a conclusion, it was a divine invitation. This commander saw the shattered Byzantine defenses and the political chaos in Constantinople not as abstract events, but as a personal opportunity. He would gather his band of riders and sweep down from the eastern highlands into valleys that had been Christian for 1,000 years. Their strategy was not to fight set peace battles, which they could not win, but to raid, to harass, and to vanish. They would strike a vulnerable monastery, a wealthy undefended town, or a remote imperial outpost, seizing plunder and captives before melting back into the landscape. The true objective, however, was more permanent than plunder. Following each raid, these Ghazi bands would often settle. They would bring their families, their flocks, and their own distinct culture, building villages and mosques where Byzantine churches once stood. They did not just conquer the land, they began to slowly transform it, season by season, generation by generation. This was the true long-term consequence of Manzikert. The battle itself lasted a single day, but the movement it unleashed would last for centuries. The political collapse in Constantinople meant no powerful army ever came to drive these settlers out. The slow, relentless process of Turkification had begun, not as a single imperial decree, but through the accumulated actions of thousands of determined individuals like this one Ghazi commander, a man whose name is lost to history, but whose legacy permanently redrew the map of a continent. How does a culture change? Not always with a single dramatic crash, but with the quiet, persistent drip of settlement and survival, until one day, the land itself speaks a new language. Their home had stood in that valley for more generations than anyone could count. The stone walls of the farmhouse were cool in the summer heat, and the fields of grain stretched out toward the distant mountains, a landscape painted in the colors of their life. For the Greek farmer and his family, this was not just a piece of the empire, it was the entire world. Then the world ended. It did not end with a great army laying siege to their village, but with a single chilling sight on the horizon. A plume of dust moving closer. It was not the orderly dust of imperial troops, but the chaotic, swift-moving cloud of Ghazi raiders. There was no time to save the land, only their lives. The family huddled in their home as the riders swept through the neighboring farms, the sounds of distant shouts and the smell of smoke carrying on the wind. They knew what came next. The choice was not a choice at all. Stay and face death or slavery, or abandon everything their ancestors had built. They filled a small cart with what little they could carry, a sack of flour, a family icon of the Virgin Mary, a few blankets. They left behind the plow in the field, the olive trees just beginning to bear fruit, and the graves of their grandparents. The farmer took one last look at his land, the only thing he had ever truly owned, and then he turned his back, joining a slow, mournful river of humanity flowing west, toward a coast and a capital that felt as distant as the moon. This was the true human cost of Manzikert, measured not in lost battles, but in lost homes. The farmer and his family were just one thread in a vast, unraveling tapestry. As they trudged along the rocky paths, they saw the new settlers moving in, Turkish families with their herds of goats and their different prayers, taking possession of the empty villages and untended fields. The land was not conquered all at once, but inhabited farm by farm, valley by valley. The Byzantine Asia Minor of old was not disappearing in a flash of steel, but fading away with the footsteps of refugees, its heartland slowly, irrevocably becoming something new. What is a kingdom without its people? An empire can lose an army and recover, but can it ever recover from the silence of its own empty fields? The echoes of the Byzantine collapse did not stop at the borders of Anatolia. They rippled across the Mediterranean, reaching the very heart of Western Christendom in Rome. When Pope Gregory Roman VII received the reports of Emperor Romanos' defeat and capture, the news struck him not merely as a political event, but as a profound spiritual crisis. The ancient Christian empire of the East, the last bulwark against the rising power of Islam in the region, had been shattered. For a pontiff of Gregory's ambition and reforming zeal, this was a call to action that transcended the old rivalries between Rome and Constantinople. He began to formulate a daring and unprecedented plan, a militarized pilgrimage he called the Militia Sancti Petri, the Army of St. Peter. His vision was not just to send aid, but to lead a massive Western army east himself, to push back the Turkish advance and, in doing so, heal the schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches under his own authority. This grand scheme never came to pass during his lifetime, thwarted by his own conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor, yet the seed was irrevocably planted. The psychological impact of Manzikert had fundamentally altered the strategic map of Europe for the men in the Vatican. The Byzantine Empire was no longer a powerful, if estranged, sister civilization. It was a desperate supplicant, its Asian heartland gone, its very survival now in question. This perception of a Christian East on the verge of extinction, a direct result of the Turkish victories that followed Manzikert, festered for 2 decades. It created a fertile ground of fear, religious fervor, and opportunity that his successor, Pope Urban Roman II, would so masterfully harvest on the fields of Clermont in 1095, launching the First Crusade. The plea from Constantinople for mercenaries had now become a call for a holy war. How does a single military defeat reshape the spiritual geography of an entire continent, setting in motion a conflict that would define relations between East and West for centuries? The merchant from Venice watched the chaos in the harbor with a calculating eye. He had come to Constantinople for silk and grain, but the real commodity now was desperation. The news from Anatolia was not just a story of lost battles, it was a seismic shift in the very foundations of trade. For centuries, the wealth of Byzantium had flowed from its Anatolian heartland, the vast fields that grew the empire's grain, the pastures that raised its sheep, the mines that yielded its silver. With that land now slipping into Turkish control, the empire's economic lungs were being crushed. The Venetians saw the consequences firsthand. The price of bread in the city was soaring. The imperial mint was producing coins of poorer and poorer quality, a silent scream of a bankrupt treasury. But where the Byzantine officials saw catastrophe, the merchants saw a breathtaking opportunity. The empire's weakness was his republic's strength. As Byzantine naval power crumbled, the Italian maritime cities, Venice and Genoa, stepped into the void. They offered the desperate emperors in Constantinople the one thing they needed: warships and hard cash. The price for this aid was not just gold, it was something far more valuable: trading privileges. The Venetians negotiated treaties that gave them their own exclusive quarters in Constantinople, entire neighborhoods where they could live under their own laws and pay little to no customs duties. They were slowly carving the commercial heart out of the empire while posing as its saviors. The merchant knew his galleys would now carry not just silk, but the very sovereignty of Byzantium, piece by piece, back to the lagoons of Venice. How quickly does a military collapse become an economic surrender, where the ones who profit most are not the conquerors on the field, but the bankers in the shadows? Even great catastrophes can be polished into legend. As the dust of Manzikert settled, the battle itself began a second life, not as a historical event, but as a powerful story shaped by the needs of those who came after. In the Christian West, the defeat was magnified into a cataclysm of almost biblical proportions. Chroniclers, hearing distant, distorted reports, wrote of an imperial army of hundreds of thousands utterly annihilated, a convenient narrative that painted the Byzantine Empire as a helpless victim in need of rescue. This exaggerated tale of collapse served a crucial purpose for popes and princes, fueling the righteous anger and sense of obligation that would help launch the Crusades a generation later. For them, Manzikert was not just a battle, it was the reason the Holy Land was threatened, a foundational tragedy that justified a holy war. Meanwhile, in the flourishing Islamic East, the story was also being burnished. Later Turkish historians, writing under the powerful Ottoman sultans who now ruled all of Anatolia, looked back to Manzikert as their glorious founding moment. They portrayed it as the single decisive blow that shattered Byzantine power forever and opened the gates of Anatolia for the permanent triumph of Islam. The reality was far more gradual, a slow erosion over decades, but the legend of a single day that changed everything was far more potent. It provided a heroic origin story for a new empire, directly linking the Ottoman throne to the valor of Alp Arslan. So the battle was remade, its complexities stripped away, the messy truths of betrayal, bad weather, and divided loyalties were smoothed over. In their place stood a clear, monumental legend, a symbol of divine favor for one side and divine punishment for the other. How many of our defining historical moments are in fact carefully crafted myths, shaped less by what actually happened and more by what future generations needed to believe? Stone by stone, a new world was rising from the old. In the city of Nicaea, where Greek had once been the language of the market and the church, a new silhouette now pierced the skyline. It was not a fortress or a palace, but a madrasa, an Islamic school of law and theology, and its architect was a man tasked with building the future. His commission came from a Seljuk governor, a clear declaration that this conquest was permanent. He was not just designing a building, he was physically imprinting a new civilization onto the landscape. His challenge was profound. He had to create a structure that was both functionally perfect for its purpose and symbolically powerful for a population still adjusting to a new reality. He likely walked the site, a plot of land that may have once held a Byzantine public building or a church, and he began to plan. His design would center on a large courtyard, an open, serene space for reflection and discussion, surrounded by vaulted halls and student cells. The most defining feature would be the Iwan, a massive vaulted portal opening onto the courtyard, a space for teaching that was both grand and intimate. This was architecture designed for community and learning, a stark contrast to the defensive walls that had defined the previous era. His materials were often local stone quarried from Anatolian hills, but his vision was born of a Central Asian heritage, blending Seljuk artistic traditions with the practicalities of his new home. As the walls rose, the local Greek and Armenian population would have watched this alien form take shape, a daily, visible reminder that the old order was gone. The architect was not a soldier, but his work was a conquest of a different kind, one of culture and permanence. With every carved geometric pattern and every gracefully arched doorway, he was quietly arguing that the Seljuks were not just raiders, but builders here to stay. How does a land truly change its identity, not only through the violence of battle, but through the patient, enduring power of a school built to last 1,000 years? His world had shrunk to the taste of blood and the weight of his own axe. The Varangian guardsman was a giant of a man from the cold north, but now he crawled through the dust like a wounded animal. One arm hung useless, shattered by a mace blow, and a deep gash on his leg left a trail of crimson behind him. He had seen the standard fall, heard the final roar of the Seljuk charge, and fought until the press of bodies broke around him. His oath to the emperor was now written in the bruises on his body and the emptiness of the field. He was utterly alone. For 3 days he moved only at night, scavenging for muddy water and hiding in ditches when Turkish patrols rode past. His journey was not a march, but a slow, agonizing retreat from one patch of cover to the next. He passed the bloated corpses of men he had trained with, their fine imperial armor stripped away, their faces unrecognizable. The grand causes of empire and faith meant nothing now. His only thought was survival, a raw animal instinct to put one more mile between himself and that field of death. He finally stumbled into a small, half-abandoned Armenian village, his massive frame and fair hair marking him as a ghost from a broken army. The villagers, their own loyalties uncertain, could have turned him in for a reward. Instead, an old woman, wordless, gave him a crust of bread and pointed him west. His epic trek was a mirror of the empire's own collapse, a slow, painful bleeding away of its strength, one broken soldier at a time. He would eventually find a ship and, years later, tell his story in a tavern by a frozen sea, a tale of a golden city and a lost emperor that no one in his homeland could truly believe. What is the price of a single oath when the empire that demanded it no longer exists? A century of stories can be undone by a single shard of pottery. The legend of Manzikert tells of a single decisive clash, but a modern archaeologist kneeling in the same dirt might tell a very different tale. Her trowel does not dig for glory, but for truth, scraping away layers of myth to find the real story written in the soil. She is not looking for lost swords or golden coins. She is searching for subtler clues, the silent witnesses that never lie. Her most powerful tool is not a map, but a science called soil micromorphology, the study of dirt under a microscope. By taking core samples from the ancient battlefield, she can analyze the soil for traces of human activity that have long since vanished from the surface. She is looking for a specific chemical signature, an unusually high concentration of phosphate. This is the ghost of a latrine, the indelible mark left by thousands of men and their animals camped in one place for an extended period. If the traditional story of a single dramatic battle is true, the phosphate levels would be concentrated in one area. But what if her samples tell a different story? What if the chemical evidence shows not one massive camp, but several smaller, scattered ones spread out over many miles? This would suggest the Byzantine army was not a single cohesive fist, but a collection of fragmented divisions that never properly united, a reality that perfectly matches the mysterious disappearance of General Tarchanautes and his 30,000 men. The soil itself would confirm that the empire marched to its doom not as one army, but as several, already divided before a single arrow was fired. Her work continues with the metal detector, a device that listens for the whispers of lost metal. The traditional narrative, fueled by later chronicles, imagines a field littered with the armor of 100,000 slain, but the beeps from her machine are frustratingly sparse. She finds arrowheads, yes, but not in the concentrated clusters a massive set-piece battle would produce. Instead, they are scattered widely as if the fighting was fluid and mobile, a running skirmish over a large area rather than a static clash of lines. She unearths a single rusted Byzantine spear point, but it is found not on the presumed main battlefield, but miles away, near a forgotten mountain pass. This single artifact could be the key to understanding the fate of Tarchanautes' missing division, evidence of a separate, smaller engagement that crippled the emperor's forces days before the main event. Each of her finds, from a broken belt buckle to the chemical ghost of a campfire, chips away at the monumental legend. They paint a picture of an army bled dry by desertion, confusion, and smaller defeats long before the final, dramatic betrayal on the field. The myth of Manzikert is a clean, sharp sword stroke that felled a giant. The archaeology, however, reveals a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow unraveling that was far more tragic and far more human than the stories ever admitted. Even today, a strange silence hangs over the plains. Local tales speak of more than just wind whispering through the dry grass. They tell of a battlefield that never truly rests, haunted by the echoes of that August day. On certain nights when the moon is thin, shepherds report hearing the distant metallic clash of steel on steel and the faint, desperate shouts of men speaking a dozen different tongues. These are the ghosts of Manzikert, not as spectral figures, but as a permanent stain on the land itself, a lingering memory of the moment the world turned. The cries are not of anger, but of profound confusion, the last thoughts of soldiers who died betrayed, their loyalty shattered by an order from their own side. You can almost feel the weight of their unanswered questions in the very air. What does a ghost remember? It does not remember strategy or empire. It remembers the thirst, the dust choking the lungs, the sight of a friend falling, and the terrifying realization that the ground beneath your feet is no longer safe. This is the true haunting, the collective trauma of an entire army imprinted upon a place, a story told not in history books, but in the shivers of those who walk there now. The land itself seems to hold its breath, a vast open grave for the Byzantine dream. How long does the echo of a single catastrophic day truly last? It lasts as long as the stories and the stories of Manzikert are etched into the soil, waiting for quiet night to speak again. A ghost from the 11th century still sits at the modern negotiating table. The legacy of Manzikert is not confined to history books. It is a living, breathing presence in the fraught geopolitics between Turkey and Greece today. The very division of the Eastern Mediterranean, a source of constant tension over airspace, islands, and undersea energy rights, traces a direct line back to that August day. When Turkish jets patrol the Aegean, they fly over a sea that was once a Byzantine lake. When Greek diplomats speak of a 2,000-year-old claim to a coastline, they are invoking a world that existed before the Seljuk victory redrew the map forever. This is not ancient history, it is the foundational narrative of two modern nations, a story of loss for one and of arrival for the other. The battle is subtly referenced in political speeches and national school curricula, not as a dusty fact, but as a symbol of a deep and enduring separation. For Turkey, Manzikert represents the moment their ancestors established a permanent home in Anatolia, the birthright of the nation. For Greece, it marks the beginning of the long, painful loss of the Greek-speaking heartland of Asia Minor, a trauma that culminated in the population exchanges of the 1920s. Every modern disagreement over a rocky islet or a drilling right is subconsciously framed by this ancient fault line. How do you negotiate a border when the other side's very identity is built upon the land you feel was historically yours? The shadow of Manzikert is long indeed, stretching across nearly a millennium to shape the anxieties and the assertiveness of nations in our own time. The true story of Manzikert is not one of a single hero or villain, but a tapestry woven from 35 distinct threads of human choice, each figure, from the ambitious emperor and the chivalrous sultan to the treacherous courtier and the nameless scout, pulled on the weave of history with their own hands. Romanos needed victory to secure his throne, a political reality that blinded him to a generous peace. Alp Arslan, pulled from another war, responded with adaptable genius. Andronikos Doukas saw not an empire to save but a rival to eliminate. The Frankish knight sought gold, the Armenian farmer his home, the Varangian his oath. None of them intended to break a world, yet together they did. This is the ultimate synthesis of Manzikert. It reveals history not as an unstoppable tide of abstract forces, economics, or fate, but as a fragile chain of individual decisions. A single act of loyalty, like the Varangians' last stand, could not outweigh a single act of betrayal from the rear guard. A scout's sharp eyes could negate the advantage of 30,000 missing soldiers. The pride of an emperor could void the wisdom of a diplomat. What if any one of them had chosen differently? What if the peace envoy had been heeded, or the standard-bearer had stood his ground for one more minute? The battle's outcome was not predetermined. It was the product of a chaotic human calculus where courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly, ambition and loyalty all collided on a single plane. The fall of the Byzantine Empire began not with a declaration of war, but in the quiet moments of decision, in the tents and on the march, long before the armies ever met. This is the legacy of the 35, a reminder that the course of our world is always ultimately in human hands. The epic saga of Manzikert is a story of collisions. An emperor's ambition collided with a sultan's pragmatism, a soldier's loyalty collided with a courtier's betrayal. The rigid formations of a classical empire collided with the fluid tactics of the steppes. On that August day, these forces did not simply meet, they shattered against one another, and the fragments of the old world were rearranged into a new one. The battle's greatest mystery is not how it was lost, but how so many individual choices, each seemingly small on its own, could combine with such catastrophic precision. It stands as a timeless cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the greatest danger to any power is rarely a foreign army, but the internal rot of hubris and division. It teaches us that war is the most unpredictable of human endeavors, where the pride of a single man can void the courage of thousands, and where a whispered order can echo for 1,000 years. So we leave you with a question, a mystery that still hangs over those distant plains. Which of these 35 figures do you find most fascinating, or who do you think holds the key to the battle's greatest unsolved puzzle? Was it the tragic Romanos, the noble Alp Arslan, the treacherous Andronikos Doukas, or perhaps one of the nameless souls, the scout or the standard bearer, whose single action tilted the balance of history? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's deepest enigmas.